The days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. David's recovery, both physical and emotional, was slow, but it was real. He was no longer the broken man who had been left to die in the desert. Slowly but surely, he began to feel alive. Again, as though the weight of the past, though heavy, had finally started to lift. Anna had never expected things to change so much. When she had first found David in the desert, she had only thought of saving him, of giving him a chance. She hadn't imagined that this chance would bring them both into something deeper. She had thought he was just another soul to care for, someone to help pass the time and offer compassion to, but now, months later, it felt like they had become something more than just two people thrown together by fate. They were, in a way, a kind of family, bound by shared pain, shared healing, and a shared understanding of what it meant to survive. David had changed. He wasn't the same man who had been found near death in the desert. The man before Anna was broken, lost in his own darkness. But now, he had found purpose again. He woke up each day with a reason to move forward, with something to give, not just to himself, but to Anna as well. His physical strength was nearly back to normal. He worked alongside Anna in the garden, planting seeds that would one day bloom into flowers and vegetables, just as he was slowly planting seeds of hope in his own heart. He was not an expert in farming, but he worked hard. The work, although tiring, gave him a sense of satisfaction, a sense of accomplishment. It made him feel connected to something greater than himself. The desert, once a place that had nearly swallowed him whole, now held life. He began to see the beauty in it, the way the land, no matter how harsh, could still sustain life, could still offer something new. But David's recovery wasn't just about physical labor. It was about his heart, his soul. The pieces of him that had been shattered in the desert were slowly being mended by his quiet companionship with Anna. The more they talked, the more they shared their lives, the more David began to realize that he wasn't alone anymore. He had someone who understood his pain, someone who had been through loss herself, who had known the depth of sorrow. The conversations between them grew deeper. Sometimes, as they sat together in the evening, the sky painted with shades of red and purple, Anna would share stories about her husband Samuel and the life they had lived together before he had passed. She spoke of the love they had shared, of the dreams they had built, and of how she had learned to find a new kind of strength after his death. David listened carefully, offering comfort when she needed it, but also understanding that he could never replace what she had lost. Similarly, when David spoke about his past, about the choices he had made and the mistakes he regretted, Anna was there to listen, to offer no judgment, but simply understanding. These late-night talks became the foundation of their bond. It wasn't about fixing each other. It wasn't about offering simple solutions to complex emotions. It was about being present for one another. And in that presence, both David and Anna had found something they hadn't realized they needed, a sense of peace. As the months passed, David found his thoughts less occupied with the past, less burdened by the regrets that had once defined him. His memories of the desert still lingered, but they no longer controlled him. He was learning to forgive himself, learning that the past, while it shaped him, did not have to define him. It was a slow process, but with Anna's support, he was starting to see that he could have a future, that he could move forward without constantly looking back. The village where Anna lived was a quiet place, a small community nestled at the edge of the desert. It wasn't a place that drew many visitors, but it was a place where people understood each other, where neighbors helped one another. David began to integrate into the village, slowly but surely. At first he kept to himself, shy and unsure of how to interact with the people who had heard nothing of his past. But as time went on, he began to help more. He helped fix things around the village, built small fences for the farmers, and offered advice to those who needed it. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show the people around him that he was willing to contribute. One day, a man from the village approached him while he was working in the garden, wiping sweat from his brow. The man's name was Elias, and he had lived in the village for as long as anyone could remember. He had seen David around, but they hadn't spoken much. Elias was older, His face weathered from years of working under the desert sun, but his eyes were kind. "You've been working hard here," Elias said, looking out at the garden that David and Anna had tended together. "The land's better for it." David smiled, though it was a little hesitant. "I'm just trying to do my part," he said. "Trying to make up for things." Elias nodded slowly as if he understood. He didn't press David for details. Instead, he looked at him thoughtfully. "I've seen people come and go in my time. Some people, they never find their way. But you found something. You found a place where you belong." David wasn't sure what to say. He had never thought of it that way before. But as he looked around at the garden, at the small house that Anna had opened to him, at the work he had done with his own hands, he realized Elias was right. He had found something. He had found a home. It wasn't just the land that had given him a sense of belonging. It was the people, especially Anna. She had given him a chance when no one else had. She had helped him see that there was still life left to live, even after all the pain and suffering he had endured. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, David was beginning to see the future, not as a dark road filled with regret, but as an open path full of possibility. As the seasons changed, so did David. The desert was still a part of him, still a place that had shaped him, but it no longer controlled him. He no longer saw it as a place of death, but as a place where life could begin again. The flowers in Anna's garden bloomed in vibrant colors, the vegetables grew tall, and David's heart, once so broken, began to bloom as well. One evening, as the stars sparkled brightly above, David and Anna sat together on the porch. The world around them was quiet, peaceful, and full of promise. They had both come a long way, and while they couldn't erase the past, they had learned to live with it. They had learned to make peace with their scars and their memories. "We've made something here, haven't we?" David said quietly, his voice filled with a sense of contentment he had never known before. Anna smiled, her eyes soft. "Yes, we have. A new beginning." David looked out over the land, the vast desert stretching before him, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of belonging. The past was no longer a weight he carried. It was a part of him, but not the only part. The rest, his future, was still waiting, and with Anna by his side, he felt ready to face it. As the days continued to pass, David's physical health improved, but the scars from his past were harder to heal. The desert had almost taken him, but Anna's persistence had given him a second chance at life. Still, there was something within him that seemed broken, something deeper than the physical wounds he had suffered. It was as if the desert had not only torn apart his body, but had also left a mark on his soul, a mark that would take much longer to heal. David spent most of his days sitting in the small room Anna had made for him, resting, eating what little food she could offer, and slowly rebuilding the strength he had lost. But even as his body grew stronger, his eyes seemed distant, as if he were looking past Anna, past the house, past the world around him. There was something he wasn't sharing, something he kept locked inside, a pain that wouldn't go away just because his wounds had begun to heal. Anna knew that the hardest part of healing wasn't the physical recovery. She had seen that firsthand, having experienced her own loss. It was the emotional scars, the things people carried inside them, that took the longest to heal. She could see that in David. He was alive, yes, but his spirit had been shattered, and it wasn't something that could be fixed in a few days. She had learned this truth from her own experiences. After losing Samuel, she had felt like a part of her was lost forever. There had been days when the grief had been so overwhelming that she could barely breathe. It took time, more time than she had ever imagined, to begin to feel whole again. And even now there were moments when the pain crept back in, when the memories of her husband's laughter, of the life they had built together, would hit her like a wave. But in the end, she had learned how to survive. And now David needed to learn how to do the same. At first, David kept to himself. He didn't talk much, didn't share any details about his past, and avoided asking Anna too many questions. He seemed content to sit in silence, staring out the window, watching the desert stretch out before him. The beauty of the vast open land should have been calming, but to David it seemed endless, just like his own pain. He had no idea how to move forward, no idea what his life could be like now that he had been given a second chance. His old life, the one that had led him into the desert, felt so distant. And yet it was still a part of him, lingering like a shadow. Anna knew that the only way to truly help David was to give him time and space, but also to gently push him forward. She began inviting him to help her with small tasks around the house. At first he hesitated, his movements slow and stiff. He wasn't used to doing anything. For so long he had been in survival mode, just trying to get through each day. The idea of actually living again, of feeling joy, of feeling connected, was foreign to him. But Anna didn't give up. She encouraged him gently, with kindness and patience. One day, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert, she invited him to take a walk with her. She didn't say much at first, just let the silence between them stretch out, the sounds of the desert filling the air. David followed her, though he moved slowly, his feet dragging through the sand. The desert had always been a part of Anna's life. It was where she had grown up, where she had learned to survive, and where she had buried so many of her memories. But to David it was something different. It was where he had almost lost everything, where his past had caught up with him in the worst way. The land had been unforgiving, and yet here he was again, walking through it not as a man on the edge of death, but as someone who had a second chance. As they walked, Anna spoke softly. She talked about the desert, about how the land could be harsh but also beautiful in its own way. She told him about the sunrise and sunset, how each day was a new beginning. David listened, though he didn't say much. It was enough for Anna to just be there with him, giving him the space he needed to begin to heal, while offering him glimpses of hope. After several weeks, David began to change. The first sign came when he started to take more interest in the world around him. He began asking questions about the village, about the people, about life. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. He started helping Anna more regularly, bringing in firewood, fixing small things around the house, and even offering to help her with some of the chores. His body was still recovering, but his spirit, slowly but surely, was beginning to come back to life. One evening, as the sky turned dark and the stars began to appear, David sat on the porch with Anna, watching the night settle over the desert. It was quiet, peaceful, and for the first time in what felt like forever, David didn't feel lost. He looked at Anna, his eyes a little softer than they had been before. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly, his voice still rough from days of silence. "You saved my life," Anna smiled gently. "You saved yourself," she replied. "I just helped you find your way back." David didn't know what to say to that. He had spent so long feeling empty, feeling like he didn't deserve to be alive, that it was hard to believe he could ever be whole again. But Anna's words felt true. It wasn't just about surviving the desert. It was about learning to live again. It was about finding the strength inside himself, the strength that he had buried deep beneath his pain. Over the next few weeks, David continued to grow stronger, not just in body, but in mind and spirit. He began to open up more, talking to Anna about his past, about his life before the desert, the people he had known, the mistakes he had made. It was a slow process, but it felt good to speak the truth, to unburden himself of the things that had haunted him for so long. Anna listened, never judging, never pushing him. She shared her own experiences too, and together they began to build a new kind of understanding. They were both survivors, both people who had experienced pain and loss, but they were also people who had found hope again, who had learned that even in the darkest of times there could be light. David knew that he wasn't the same person he had been before the desert. He had been broken, but now he was slowly putting the pieces back together. He knew he would never forget the man he had been, the man who had walked into the desert with nothing but anger and regret. But he also knew that he had a choice. He could choose to live, to move forward, and to find purpose again. And with Anna's help, he was beginning to see that it was possible. For the first time in a long time, David felt like he had something to live for. The desert no longer felt like a place of death, but a place of second chances, and for that he was grateful. The days that followed were long and grueling, filled with uncertainty and hard work. David's condition was fragile. He lay on the small cot, unconscious for what felt like an eternity, while Anna worked tirelessly to keep him alive. She did everything she could think of, from keeping his wounds clean to offering him water even when he couldn't drink much. The heat of the desert had drained his strength, and it seemed like a miracle that he was still holding on. Anna couldn't explain it, but something inside her told her she had to keep going. She had lived through loss before, but this time she wasn't going to let another life slip away. Every day she checked on him, watching for any signs that he might be improving, hoping that something, anything, would show that he was still there, that he was still fighting. At first, there were no changes. David remained still, his face flushed with fever, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. His skin, once pale from dehydration, now looked even worse, sallow, tight, and covered in beads of sweat. His body was weak, and his muscles felt like they were made of stone, refusing to move. Anna didn't know if he was ever going to wake up or if he had even a chance of surviving. But she refused to give up. She had to believe that he could make it. She spent her days caring for him and her nights praying, her mind torn between the fear that he would never recover and the hope that he would somehow open his eyes and tell her his name, his story. David's body was a mess. His wounds, though not life-threatening, were deep and infected from days in the desert heat. Anna knew that infection could kill him if she didn't act quickly. She used the little medicine she had, mostly herbal remedies she had learned about from her mother, to try to keep the infections at bay. The smell of dried herbs and oils filled the room as she worked to clean his cuts and bruises, each movement done with the kind of care and tenderness she hadn't shown anything or anyone in a long time. It wasn't just about saving him. It was about doing something good in a world that had often been so cruel. David didn't wake up on the second day, or the third, but Anna kept going, following the same routine each morning and evening, offering him water and wiping his brow with cool cloths. She spoke to him, though he never responded. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she talked anyway. Sometimes she told him about her husband, Samuel, and how much she missed him. Other times she spoke about the desert, how it had always been both beautiful and unforgiving, a place where life and death coexisted in quiet harmony. She told him about the village, her life there, and how she had learned to survive in the wake of grief. Each word she spoke seemed to hang in the air between them, but nothing changed. For days it felt as though nothing was happening at all. Then, on the fourth day, something small and almost imperceptible happened. David's eyelids fluttered just for a moment. Anna had been sitting beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, when she felt a shift. His fingers twitched. She looked up, her breath catching in her throat, and for the first time in days she allowed herself to hope. "David," she whispered softly, unsure if he could even hear her. There was no response. But for Anna, the small movement was enough. It meant he was still there. The fight hadn't left him. That night she stayed by his side, watching over him as he lay still. His fever was breaking, though it wasn't gone completely. The sweat still coated his skin and his breathing was irregular, but Anna knew it was a sign of progress. She felt an overwhelming sense of relief, as though she had been holding her breath for days, and finally she could exhale. The next morning, when Anna returned to check on him, she found something even more hopeful. David's eyes were open. They were barely focused, but they were open, and for the first time he blinked slowly. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Anna's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what to do first. Should she speak to him? Should she wait for him to say something? But before she could say a word, he lifted a hand slightly as though trying to speak. She placed her hand gently on his, not wanting to overwhelm him, but desperate for any sign that he recognized her. "You're safe now," Anna said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. David didn't answer. Instead, he just stared at her, his eyes filled with confusion and pain. He looked lost, like someone who had forgotten where he was or who he was. It was a moment that left Anna feeling a mix of relief and uncertainty. She wasn't sure how much of his memory had returned, or if he even remembered anything at all, but she didn't care. All that mattered in that moment was that he was alive. Days passed, and slowly David's strength began to return. His breathing became steadier, and the fever finally broke. The feverish delirium faded, and he started to speak, though his voice was weak and raspy at first. Anna encouraged him to drink more water, and she helped him sit up when he felt strong enough. But David didn't speak much about his past. When Anna asked him where he had come from or who had done this to him, he would look away as if the questions were too much to answer. There were times when he seemed lost, as though his memories were distant like shadows in the back of his mind. But slowly, with each passing day, he began to move a little more, to eat a little more, and to become a little less like the broken man she had found in the desert. Still, there was an air of sadness about him, a kind of quiet desperation that Anna couldn't ignore. He wasn't just physically healing. There was something deeper inside him that was wounded, and she couldn't help but wonder what he had been through before he ended up on her doorstep. One evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky with colors of orange and red, David spoke again. His voice was clearer now, though it still held a trace of the weakness that had been part of him since his arrival. "Why did you help me?" His voice was low, almost hesitant, as though he couldn't believe what had happened to him. Anna paused for a moment before answering. "Because I couldn't leave you to die," she said quietly. "I've been through loss. I know what it feels like to lose everything. But you don't have to be alone. Not like this." David looked at her, his eyes softening. There was a long silence, one that seemed to stretch between them as though they were both trying to figure out what to say next. But for the first time since Anna had found him, the air between them felt less heavy. There was no immediate answer, no grand declaration, but in that moment there was understanding, and that was enough for now. Anna had always preferred the silence of the desert. It was a place where she could escape from the reminders of her grief, where she didn't have to face the world, and where no one could ask her how she was doing. Since her husband had passed away, life had become a series of empty days, filled with silence and solitude. Their small house, tucked away at the edge of a dusty village, seemed to echo with the absence of his laughter, his voice, his presence. But Anna had learned to live with the silence, as difficult as it was. It had become her companion, her constant. Each morning, as the sun began to rise and cast golden light over the desert, Anna would walk. It wasn't so much a walk as it was a ritual, a way for her to fill the time with something meaningful. Her feet moved slowly over the sand, each step deliberate, as though she were trying to leave behind the weight of her sorrow, one step at a time. The desert air was dry and still, with the faintest scent of sagebrush and earth. It was a calming presence, a quiet place where she could breathe and remember but also forget. On this particular morning, Anna walked farther than usual. Her heart felt heavy, as it often did, but there was a stirring inside her, a quiet pull to go beyond the familiar paths. The sun was beginning to heat the earth beneath her, and though the desert was beautiful, it was also dangerous. But Anna wasn't afraid. She was used to the dangers of the land, used to the solitude it offered. As she wandered through the barren landscape, her thoughts drifted back to the life she had shared with her late husband, Samuel. She could still see his face so clearly in her mind, his smile, his strong hands, the way he had held her close when the world seemed too big to handle. But now all she had were memories, and memories weren't enough. She had tried to move on, tried to find purpose again, but nothing had filled the hole he had left behind. Walking in the desert gave her a strange kind of peace, but it also reminded her of everything she had lost. It was during one of these walks that something unusual happened. As Anna made her way over a small hill, her gaze fell upon a figure in the distance. At first she thought it was a mirage, a trick of the light, but as she got closer, her heart skipped a beat. There, lying motionless on the sand, was a man. His body was crumpled in a way that suggested he was either unconscious or dead. She stopped dead in her tracks, a cold chill running through her spine. She had heard of people being abandoned in the desert, left to die by those who no longer wanted them. The desert, with its scorching heat and endless horizon, had a way of swallowing people whole, and once someone was lost, there was little chance of ever finding them again. But this man, this stranger, seemed different. She had no idea who he was or how he had ended up in such a dreadful condition, but there was something about him that pulled at her heart. Without thinking, Anna rushed forward. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the man, her mind racing with questions. Was he alive? Had he been there for long? She could see that his clothes were torn, his body battered and bruised, and his skin was parched from the heat. His face was pale and his lips were cracked like he hadn't had a drink of water in days. He was in bad shape, and Anna knew she couldn't leave him out here. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she gently touched his shoulder. His skin was burning with fever, and his breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. For a moment she just stared at him, unsure of what to do. She didn't know who he was, didn't know anything about him, but in that moment it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was alive, or at least, still clinging to life. And she couldn't just leave him to die. Anna looked around, hoping to spot someone, anyone who could help. But there was no one in sight. The vast desert stretched out endlessly, and she knew she was the only one who could make a difference now. She had no idea where to start, but she knew she had to act fast. She couldn't let him die out here. Her first instinct was to get him back to her house. It wasn't much, but it was better than leaving him exposed to the elements. Carefully, Anna lifted him, using all the strength she could muster. He was heavier than she expected, and his body felt limp and unresponsive, but she managed to drag him across the sand, inch by inch. Every movement felt like an eternity. Sweat poured down her face, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. It was slow going, and the weight of the man's unconscious body made the task feel impossible. But Anna didn't give up. The sun was relentless, beating down on them both, but she pushed on. She thought about what her husband would have done. He had always been the one to take charge, to handle the tough situations, but now it was her. She was the one in charge, and she had to get him to safety. Finally, after what felt like hours, Anna reached her home, exhausted and drenched in sweat. She had no idea how she managed to drag the man so far, but she was thankful that she had. Her heart raced as she carefully laid him down on the small cot in her home. His body still burning with fever. She moved quickly to gather water and cloths, doing what she could to cool him down. She knew she wasn't a healer, but she also knew that if she didn't do something, he wouldn't survive. The man's breathing was shallow, and his face was grimacing in pain. Anna's mind raced with questions. Who was he? How had he ended up in the desert? And most importantly, how could she help him? She didn't know the answers, but one thing was clear. She had to try. As the hours passed, Anna did what she could to care for him. She bathed his face with cool cloths, fed him small sips of water, and prayed that he would wake up. She had no idea if he would or if he had any chance of surviving, but she refused to give up. She couldn't let him die like this. The night fell and the temperature dropped, but Anna couldn't sleep. She stayed by the man's side, watching over him as he lay unconscious. The quiet of the desert night surrounded her, but she didn't feel the loneliness that had consumed her before. Somehow this man, this stranger, had brought her out of her grief, if only for a moment. She wasn't alone anymore, and as she sat by his side, waiting for him to wake, she couldn't help but feel that their fates were somehow connected, that this was the beginning of something she couldn't yet understand. David could hardly remember how he had ended up here, stranded in the middle of an unforgiving desert. The air was thick with heat, and the sun beat down on him like a fiery hammer. His body ached. Each breath was shallow, and the dry, parched earth beneath him seemed to swallow any hope he might have had left. His mind was foggy, his thoughts blurry like a half-remembered dream, but he knew one thing for sure. He was alone. The world had moved on without him, and no one was coming to help. His journey had started with hope like any other. There had been a time when he had a purpose, a goal, a reason to keep moving forward. But somewhere along the way things had gone wrong. So very wrong. A betrayal, a mistake. And now he was here, under the harsh sun, slowly fading away, no one to care. His hands, once strong and steady, now trembled weakly at his sides. The burning sand clung to his skin, sticking to the sweat that dripped endlessly from his brow. His throat was dry like sandpaper and his lips cracked from dehydration. Every inch of his body screamed with exhaustion, but he didn't have the energy to move. It felt as though his body had given up, and his mind was following suit. He had long since stopped calling for help. There was no one. There would be no rescue. He was just another casualty of a world that had little mercy for the weak. David's eyes fluttered open again, but the bright sunlight was too much. He squinted and tried to lift a hand to shield his face, but it was too heavy. His fingers could barely move. His chest felt tight, his heart beating in slow, labored thuds. He couldn't even remember the last time he had drunk water. Days, hours? He couldn't tell. Time didn't matter here. The desert had a way of stealing it away, just like it had stolen his hope. The silence around him was deafening. The vast, endless stretch of sand seemed to stretch out forever, with no sign of life in sight. No animals, no plants, just an empty, barren landscape that seemed to mock his suffering. He thought back to the last moments he remembered, before everything had turned into chaos. The faces of the men who had left him to die still haunted him. He had trusted them once, trusted them with his life. But trust had been a fragile thing, and now it lay broken in the desert just like him. A faint memory flickered in his mind, a voice calling out, a promise made. He tried to focus on it, but it slipped away just as quickly as it had come. Was it real? Or was it just the heat playing tricks on him? The sun blazed above, relentless in its intensity, making the world around him shimmer and distort. The desert felt like it was swallowing him whole, each breath making it harder to hold on. He thought back to his life before all of this, before the chaos and the bloodshed. He had once been a man with dreams, a man with a future. Now all that was left was a body broken by betrayal and an unforgiving world that seemed content to let him die alone. He tried to lift his head, just to see if there was any hope on the horizon, but the effort was too much. His vision blurred again and his head fell back to the ground with a soft thud. His thoughts grew more and more distant, slipping away like the tide pulling at the shore. As the hours stretched on, he began to drift in and out of consciousness. There were moments when he felt as though he were floating, as though his body were no longer tied to the harsh reality of the desert. In those moments, he thought about his family, his mother, his sister, faces he would never see again. He thought about the life he had once known, full of laughter, love, and hope. How had it all gone so wrong? The shadows grew longer as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. The temperature, which had been unbearable just moments before, began to drop ever so slightly. But it didn't bring him relief. It only made his body ache more. His legs were stiff, his arms weak and trembling. He was aware that if he didn't get help soon, there would be no tomorrow. There would be no one to remember him, no one to care that he had once existed. His death, if it came, would be as silent and unnoticed as the desert itself. David's thoughts drifted again, but this time, something was different. A distant sound reached his ears, faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. It was a voice, a real human voice. He tried to open his eyes again, but they felt so heavy. His eyelids fluttered, his lashes sticking together from the sweat and dirt that had accumulated. Was it a dream? Or was it someone? Someone who had finally come to find him. But as quickly as the voice had come, it faded. The silence returned, deeper than before. His head swam, his thoughts lost in a haze of fatigue and pain. He couldn't tell if he was imagining things or if someone truly was out there. The heat continued to press down on him like a weight he couldn't escape. And then, as if the world had given him one last fleeting chance, he heard it again, closer now. Footsteps. Real, solid footsteps in the sand. But David was too weak to move, too weak to call out. All he could do was lie there, struggling to breathe, waiting for the unknown to either save him or leave him to his fate. The desert, in its ruthless beauty, had claimed many lives before him, and now it seemed as though it would take his too. But the footsteps grew louder, closer, as if fate had decided that his story wasn't over just yet. Whether by miracle or sheer willpower, someone had come. The last thing David remembered before the darkness took him again was the soft, comforting voice calling his name, gently coaxing him back from the edge.